Hello, fourth grade, and welcome to lesson 5-5 of math. Last lesson, we talked about interpreting remainders and what a remainder was and how to use it. For this lesson, we're going to work on using partial quotients to divide. So just like we used partial products when we multiplied, partial quotients are used to divide so that we can break it apart just like we broke apart multiplication. So we would take our number, break it apart into its different place values, and then solve that way. Let's go ahead and watch our short video lesson, and then we're going to get into our notes, our examples, and our guided practice together.
How can you use partial quotients to solve division problems? There are 3 seats in each row of an airplane for passengers. If there are 63 people boarding the airplane, how many rows of seats are needed for the passengers? This bar diagram shows the problem, where R equals the number of rows. Which operation can you use to solve the problem?
Select your answer.
So for this part, if we need to figure out how many groups of 3 there are in 63, we're going to take 63 and we need to divide it equally into groups of 3 to figure out how many groups we have left.
How many groups of 3 counters can be taken away from 63? You can divide by finding partial quotients until only a remainder, if any, is left. How many 3s are in 63? Try 10. 10 groups of 3 is 30. 63 minus 30 equals 33. How many 3s are in 33? Try 10. 10 groups of 3 is 30. 33 minus 30 equals 3. How many 3s are in 3? 1. 1 group of 3 is 3. 3 minus 3 equals 0. 10, 10, and 1 are partial quotients. There are 21 groups of 3 in 63.
So let's stop and take a look at what they did here. So first they said, they looked at the number 63 and they said, okay, I know for sure there are 10 groups of 3 in 63. So 10 times 3 is 30. So we took away 30 from our 63, and then we had 33 left over. And again, looking at 33, I know there's at least 10 groups of 3 in that. So they put another 10. That was their second partial quotient. They subtracted 30 from there, and then they had 3 left over. And then looking at it, there's one group of 3 in 3. So they put the 1 up there, subtracted off the 3, and then there was 0 remainder. So these numbers on top are considered or called partial quotients. They took apart the 63, they broke it into 30 and 30 and 3, and figured out how many groups of 3 were in each one of those. So in 30, there are 10 groups. In the other 30, there were another 10 groups. And in the last group of 3, there was 1 group.
Sometimes you can use a different first estimate.
Now here it says drag the slider to explore the steps in using partial quotients to divide. So maybe you didn't want to start with 30 as your first number. You could have started as how many groups of 3s are there in 63? So they said 20, because we know 3 times 2 is 6. So 3 times 20 is 60. So they put 20 on top as their first partial quotient. Then they did their subtraction and they found out that they had 3 left over here. Now they could divide again. 3 divided by 3 is 1, right? There's one group of 3 in 3. They did their subtraction, and then they added their 2 partial quotients, 20 plus 1, which gave them 21. So they were still able to reach the same answer. They just used a different estimate when they started.
There are 21 groups of 3 in 63. 21 rows of seats are needed.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at our notes, our examples, and our guided practice for this lesson. So at the top of our page, we have the lesson title 5-5, using partial quotients to divide. So partial quotients, just like partial products, help you to break apart your equation and solve it in smaller, easier pieces. Then you add the partial quotients together to find your whole quotient and decide if there are any left over. So just like with partial products, where we found our partial answers and then we added them together, you're doing the same thing here when you're working with partial quotients. So how can I find 63 divided by 3 using partial quotients? I can do it a couple of different ways. One way I can do it is to create a bar diagram. So I can either do it as 63 broken up into groups of 3 to figure out how many groups, or I could do 63 broken up into 3 groups and figure out how many are going to go inside each group. Either way, my answer is going to be the same. I could also use counters and repeated subtraction until I get to 0, or until you can't take away more groups of 3 at a time. So I can begin my repeated subtraction over and over and over again until I get to 0, and then count how many times I was able to do it. Or I can stack and divide using partial quotients, just like they did in the example. So I need to think, for 63 divided by 3, how many 3s are in 60? So let's start with that. Before we look at the 3, let's just take a look at the 60. So that 6 is in the tens place, right? So 6 tens is 60. How many groups of 3 are there in 60? Well, I know there's 6 in the tens place. So when I write my answer is going to level on top of the tens place. I know that 3 times 2 is 6. So 3 times 20 is 60. So I put my 20 on top, that's my partial quotient, and then I subtracted a group of 60 to figure out how much I have left over. When I subtracted them from each other, 63 minus 60, I ended up with just that 3 left over. Next, I had to stop and think, how many 3s are there in one group of 3? I know there's 1, so I'm going to write that on top. And I'm going to subtract off that one group of 3, and I'm going to have nothing left over. Now, the last thing I need to remember to do is to add my partial quotients together to find my whole quotient. So these two together are my partial quotients. I need to add them together to find my answer. So my partial quotients were 20 and 1. Together, they made 21. So that tells me that 63 divided by 3 is equal to 21. Now, the way you check your work is to do the inverse operation. Remember, that means the opposite. So the opposite of division is multiplication. Instead of doing 63 divided by 3 is 21, you can do 21 times 3. And if you get 63, then you know your answer is correct. Now, if you were working with an equation that had remainders, after you did your multiplication, you would have added in the remainders to see if you got back to your original dividend that you were given. Let's go ahead and take a look at another example of how to use partial quotients. So one way you could do it is you could break it into its place values by using the distributive property. That's one strategy. If I had, for example, to find 95 divided by 5. So one strategy could be to break it into its partial product, or sorry, into its place values. So I'm going to use a distributive property here to distribute 95 into 90 and 5. So I'm taking that 95 and I'm breaking it apart into these two different parentheses. So 95 divided by 5 becomes 90 divided by 5 plus 5 divided by 5. 90 divided by 5 is 18. 5 divided by 5 is 1. Together, that gives me 19. Now, the next strategy I can use is to use my partial product, or sorry, my partial quotients. So I can stack them over here. I'm going to start with 95 divided by 5. Remember, your dividend, your whole number goes under the bridge. Your divisor, what you're dividing by, goes outside the bridge, and your quotients or partial quotients are going to go on top of the bridge. So first, I need to think, how many 5s are there in 90? Well, I know there's at least 10. There's at least 10 groups of 5 in 90. So I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to do 5 times 10, and that's 50. So I'm going to subtract 50 off from here after I wrote my 10 on top, and I'll see that I have 45 left over. Next, I need to stop and think, how many 5s are there in 45? Well, I know that 9 times 5 is 45. So I'm going to put my 9 up on top. I'm going to subtract the 45. And here you can see that I have 0 left. And finally, my last step is I'm going to add my partial quotients together. I'm going to add that 10 and that 9 together to get 19. And that tells me that 95 divided by 5 is going to give me 19. Now, again, to check your work, do the inverse operation, do the opposite. 19 times 5, if that gives you 95, then you know you're correct. Next, let's take a look at our guided practice questions. For number 1, it says 84 divided by 4. Use the distributive property to show why Harry's array model works to solve. So in your book, you have an array. And you need to show 84 divided by 4. So I'll show you what that looks like right now so that you can see it. And we'll go ahead and skip ahead onto our guided practice here. So for your guided practice, it says Harry used the model below to find 84 divided by 4. Use a distributive property to show why Harry's strategy works. So 84, the way you're going to make 84 is just like the model that we have here. So he has 4 groups of 20 and 4 groups of 1. So 20 and 1, then another 20 and 1, another 20 and 1, and another 20 and 1. Now, the reason this model works is your whole number is going to be the total number of your array. So the whole array, what is the sum of all of those parts? Or if you multiplied it together to find your answer. So 21 times 4 is going to give you your dividend. That's your 84 right there. And you can see that they're broken up into groups of 4. So why does his model work? Well, 84 divided by 4, he broke it up using the distributive property. So he broke it into its place values. 84 divided by 4 becomes 80 divided by 4 plus 4 divided by 4, because we broke that 84 into 80 plus 4 more. So first, we're going to use our basic facts to find out what 80 divided by 4 is. I know that 8 divided by 4 is 2. So 8 tens divided by 4 is going to give me 2 tens, which is 20. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And then I add my partial quotients. 84 divided by 4 equals 21. And as you saw in the array that Harry made in the question, you saw them broken up into 4 equal groups with 21 in each group. Now for number 2, they're asking you to solve, and the question says, how many groups of 4 are there in 48? So you're going to figure out 48 divided by 4. So I'm going to stack and do my division using my partial quotients. Now I need to stop and think. 48 divided by 4. How many groups of 4 are there in 40? So I'm going to start there. I know there's 10 groups of 4 in 40, so I wrote my 10 up on top. And then I subtracted 40. I took 40 out of my dividend. So 48 minus 40 gave me 8. Then I had to figure out how many groups of 4 are there in 8. And I know there's 2 groups of 4 in 8 because 4 times 2 is 8. I put my 2 on top. I subtracted off the 8 and I did not have any remainders here. Now my next step is to add my partial quotients together. So first I did 40 divided by 4, and I did 8 divided by 4 afterwards. So 40 divided by 4 gave me that 10. 8 divided by 4 gave me that 2. When I added those two partial quotients together, I found out that 10 plus 2 is equal to 12. So 48 divided by 4 equals 12. Now to check my answer, I can do the inverse operation. I can do 12 times 4 to figure out my answer. If I get 48, then I know my work is correct. And for your last question on your guided practice, it says how many groups of 6 are there in 78? So we're going to do 78 divided by 6. Now I need to think how many groups of 6 are there in 70? Let's start with that first. Well, I know there's at least 10 groups of 6 in 70 because 10 times 6 is 60. So I put my partial quotient up here and I did 6 times 10 gave me 60, and I subtracted that from my 78. 78 minus 60 gave me 18. Next, I had to think, how many groups of 6 are there in 18? Well, I know there's 3 groups of 6 in 18 because 6 times 3 is 18. So I put my 3 up here as my partial quotient, and then I subtracted it, 6 times 3 is 18, from the 18 that I had over here, and I had no remainders. Next, I put my partial quotients together, and I found out that my whole quotient is 13. So 78 divided by 6 equals 13. There are 13 groups of 6 in the number 78. Go back and review any part of the lesson that you like if you need additional support. Go over your notes. You guys all have copies of this right now. Go over the steps that are listed to help you figure out what step to do first, second, and third until you get to your final answer. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have an amazing day. Take care. Bye-bye.